Hello there, welcome to Cool Talk. Today we discuss the 1950s. And much like the last video, we are going to go year by year. But once in a while we will stop and pause and catch a little summary of a topic because sometimes these events overlap. We're going to go year by year, but you could tell that the 1950s was dominated by the rivalry between the United States and the Soviet Union. In other words, the Cold War. Let's begin. In 1950, Henri Matisse wins the Venice Prize for Art. King Leopold III of Belgium abdicates the throne. He was very unpopular because of his neutrality during World War II. Athena Gibson becomes the first African American to compete in the U.S. Tennis Association. And Florence Chadwick breaks the record and crosses the English Channel in 13 hours and 25 minutes. Famous people who died in 1950 include the poet Edna St. Vincent Millay, actor Al Jolson, playwright George Bernard Shaw, and the greatest dancer of the century, Vaslav Nijinsky. Died at 60. He had spent 30 years battling schizophrenia. American President Harry Truman's daughter, Margaret, went off on a singing career. Now, when one critic dared to criticize her singing, the president threatened to break his nose. It was also the year of the first successful kidney transplant. Alfred Hiss was sentenced to 5 years perjury, denying that he gave top secrets to the Soviets. Now, Senator Joseph McCarthy, he began his crusade against any Americans suspected of having communist affiliations. Many were arrested, lives were ruined, and even though he had a lot of support from many Americans, some feel that he went too far. This is Eugene Karp. He was American. And some say he was a spy. We don't know, but listen to this. He did go to a Robert Vogelaire's residence, another American who had been accused of espionage and convicted. Well, Eugene Karp went to Vogelaire's house, maybe to retrieve documents. We don't know. The point is, he got on the Orient Express on a train to go to Paris, but he never made it. He was found on a tunnel, allegedly beaten and thrown off the train by two Hungarian agents. Today, he's buried in Arlington Cemetery. German-born Klaus Fuchs was sentenced in London to 14 years in prison for selling nuclear secrets to the Soviets. As mentioned, there was a rivalry between the Soviet Union and the new superpower, the United States. It was the Cold War, and it was going on in earnest. Western Europe would ally with the US, and the Soviets would obtain many nations to join them from Eastern Europe. The United States was enjoying a booming economy, and a new generation of babies were born after World War II. They were known as the baby boomers. With the Marshall Plan, Europe had made an astounding recovery. Now, North Korea, communist North Korea, would invade South Korea, probably encouraged by the Soviets. Now, the United States sent troops to South Korea to push back the North Koreans. But then the Chinese intervened, and the U.S. was forced out of the North. The war would continue for about 3 years, and it would end in a stalemate, even though both sides would claim victory. About 5 million people died in the Korean War. 180,000 of them were Chinese, and about 36,000 of them were Americans. The war was not very long, but it was very deadly. Now, President Harry S. Truman had sent General Douglas MacArthur to oversee the war efforts. MacArthur had his differences with Truman, would do whatever he wanted, so Truman fired him. In spite of this firing, MacArthur was hugely successful with the American people and he got his parade. As for President Harry S. Truman, he became very unpopular. In fact, he has one of the lowest popularity polls in American history, 22%. Let's look at some successful television shows from the 1950s. Those that died in 1951 include Ferdinand Porsche, the car designer, comedian Fanny Brice, publisher William Randolph Hearst. He was the inspiration for Citizen Kane, and William Kellogg from Kellogg Cornflakes. He was 91. Soldier John R. Rice died in the Korean War. He was Native American, and because of this, many cemeteries would not allow him to be buried there. So President Truman authorizes for him to be buried in Arlington Cemetery. The Shah of Iran marries for the second time, and he also nationalizes oil. And Julius and Ethel Rosenberg were found guilty of espionage for selling nuclear secrets to the Soviets. They would be executed in 1953. The musical The King and I would appear on stage. In a few years, it would become a movie. It's based on the true story of a teacher, Anna Leonwins, who would go to Siam, which is today's Thailand, to tutor the children of King Mugkut. Now, King Mugkut had 82 children. CBS began color broadcasting, but people were still hesitant to buy color TVs because some TVs were only compatible with CBS. In Jordan, King Abdullah was assassinated by an Arab terrorist. His grandson, Prince Hussein, would take over. He was 17 years of age. Germany agrees to pay Jews war reparations, so $822 million was given to the Israeli government. Latin America was very underdeveloped. The people were very illiterate, poor, there was a lot of malnutrition. Latin America had many resources, but it was in the hands of the few. Lack of capital disallowed economic potential. Colombia had coffee, Cuba had sugar, Chile had copper, Nicaragua had bananas, Bolivia had tin, Venezuela had oil, but perhaps only Mexico really prospered. It would become one of the most stable governments in Latin America. It was the 1952 Olympics in Finland. That year, there were several deaths, among them Maria Montessori, educator John Dewey, poet George Santayana, Eva Perón from Argentina, and King George. King George would pass away. His daughter Elizabeth would become the new queen. She was in Kenya at the time when they gave her the news. And speaking of Kenya, the tribe, the Mambaos, went into rebellion, struggling to get the British out. This led to atrocities and tortures and killings throughout the whole country. It would last until 1963. Now, one person who was tortured was Hussein Onyingo Obama. This is former President Barack Obama's grandfather. The first successful mechanical heart was used for about 80 minutes and then the patient died. General Mohammed Naguib takes over Egypt. Rocky Marciano becomes the heavyweight champion of the world. And George Jorgensen would become Christine Jorgensen, the first transsexual to come out publicly. Former General Dwight D. Eisenhower becomes the first Republican president in 20 years. Albert Schweitzer, theologian, wins the Nobel Peace Prize. And across the world, as colonialism is dying, countries pit the United States and the Soviet Union against each other. Many countries in Asia would become independent during this decade. However, because they were underdeveloped and lacked capital, they were still dependent on other nations. The world was shocked when Soviet leader Joseph Stalin died. Nobody knew what was going to happen. Now, Nikita Khrushchev would maneuver his way to the top and become the new Soviet leader. He would later surprisingly denounce Stalinism. James Baldwin published Go Tell It on the Mountain. Playwright Samuel Beckett wrote Waiting for Godot, and Ray Bradbury published Fahrenheit 451. It was also the year that the Yankee Stadium was full of Jehovah's Witnesses who in one day baptized 4,640 people. John F. Kennedy marries Jacqueline Bouvier. Jonas Salk develops a polio vaccine, saving millions. And for the first time, pregnancy was induced with frozen sperm. Yugoslavia and Italy claimed the province of Trieste. They would end up dividing it among them. Singer Hank Williams died, as well as playwright Eugene O'Neill. And then Edmund Hillary and his guide Tenzing became the first to climb Mount Everest successfully. 19-year-old Elvis Presley signs up with Sam Phillips of Sun Records, and the rest is music history. In less than a decade, he would become one of the top entertainers of all time. 50 million people in the United States now have electricity. CBS commentator Edward Murrow would criticize Senator Joseph McCarthy, who continued to attack people often unfairly of having communist sympathies. Senator McCarthy begins to lose support. Hundreds would die when riots broke out in India and Pakistan. Colonel Castillo Armas takes over Guatemala, while Brazilian President Getulio Vargas commits suicide. Alan Turing, the inventor of the computer, dies. He bit an apple that had cyanide, either accidentally or intentionally. The new IBM computer can perform 10 million operations in 1 hour. Athlete Roger Bannister breaks the 4-minute mile. And in New York, a new coffee maker can make 2 cups of coffee in 4 minutes. Gideon Sundback, the inventor of the zipper, died, as did Jacques Brandenburger, the inventor of cellophane. Painter Matisse also passed away at the age of 81. England would officially hand over the Suez Canal to Egypt. 2 big publications came out that year, Lord of the Flies and Lord of the Rings. Ernest Hemingway would win the Nobel Prize for Literature, and a new giant telescope would give credence to the Big Bang Theory. In Vietnam, the French had left. Vietnam had been divided in 2. In the north were the communists led by Ho Chi Minh. In the south were anti-communists. There was supposed to be a free election to unite both sides, but the elections never happened, and the north began guerrilla warfare against the south. The United States became alarmed, and before the end of the decade, they started sending weapons and troops. Now, in Africa, between 1950 and 1970, 40 countries became independent, but the only relative successful one was Nigeria. With independence came problems. There was little or no political unity in these countries. When the Europeans left, the tribes that remained made up 50 territories and 800 languages. There was overpopulation, depleted food supply, and they couldn't extract raw materials without industry. Inexperience brought dictatorship. Marian Anderson becomes the first African American to sing at the Metropolitan Opera House. Charlie Parker, jazz giant, dead at 34 from a drug overdose. James Dean, actor, dead at 24 from a car crash. And Albert Einstein passes away at 76. Movie star Marilyn Monroe and baseball giant Joe DiMaggio get divorced. New York installs the first Don't Walk signs. Representatives from 29 African and Asian nations meet to denounce colonialism, and West Germany is now free of occupation. In Algeria, rebels would fight against the French. Now, this war would take the lives of hundreds of thousands and would end with Algerian independence in 1962. And if you like these little paintings over here, they were made by a 95-year-old woman known as Grandma Moses. Grandma Moses used to scrub floors for a living, and she only started painting at the age of 77. She would continue painting until the age of 101. The first Disney amusement park would open in California. Now, as mentioned in a previous video, Mao Zedong had taken over mainland China. He established communism. He did open schools for peasants, reformed land ownership, lowered the rents, and aimed to build up the military. But to do all of this, his weapon was terror. Family loyalties and Confucian traditions were done away with. Millions would die in the farm collectives and communes. And by the end of the decade, a great famine would kill over 15 million people. The FBI solved a 6-year-old case where they caught the perpetrators of the Brinks job. A group of men had broken into a Brinks armed car headquarters and walked away with $2.7 million. Most of the gang was rounded up and arrested, but the money was never recovered. Rosa Parks refuses to give up her seat on a bus in a white section, and she was arrested. Martin Luther King intervened. He was also arrested, but a boycott against buses and blacks ensues, and the African Americans would win. Meanwhile, Autherine Lucy was the first African American to be admitted to the University of Alabama. She was greeted with rocks and eggs. Singer Nat King Cole was attacked by a white crowd in Birmingham, Alabama. Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev had reached out to other countries like Yugoslavia to tell them that the Soviets would allow them to become communist on their own without their influence if they wanted to decide their own fate. But when protests broke out in Hungary, Nikita Khrushchev sent out the tanks and crushed the revolt. Painter Jackson Pollock passes away. A Jewish couple in the United States was not allowed to adopt 2 Catholic twins. China takes over 1,000 square miles of Burma. Morocco would become independent. U.S. President had approved of $33 billion in highways and roads, and with this, the suburban housing developments would boom. In Israel, General Moshe Dayan would conquer the Sinai Peninsula. Israel then decides to hold on to the Gaza Strip for security purposes. The 1950s was a great decade for movies. Now, Watch Mojo on YouTube has decided that some of these films were the best films of the decade. Marlon Brando and Vivien Leigh would star in A Streetcar Named Desire. Vivien Leigh would pick up her second Oscar. Aforementioned James Dean, who would die the same year, would appear in Rebel Without a Cause. Now, he would posthumously have 2 Oscar nominations. Akira Kurosawa would direct The Seven Samurai, often imitated, never duplicated. Ben-Hur manages to be epic, personal, spiritual, and the chariot race at the end is still exciting. Cary Grant appeared in North by Northwest by Alfred Hitchcock, and director Sidney Lumet would create suspense out of 12 men in a room in the film 12 Angry Men. Alfred Hitchcock would direct Rear Window, and we would get one of the greatest musicals of all time, Singing in the Rain. There was Bridge Over the River Kwai and the masterpiece On the Waterfront, where Marlon Brando finally picked up his first Oscar. Humphrey Bogart passed away, as did Senator Joseph McCarthy. Labor leader Jimmy Hoffa was indicted for racketeering. Books came out such as Atlas Shrugged, On the Road, and Dr. Seuss's The Cat in the Hat. Israel withdraws from the Gaza Strip, but regardless, Egypt won't allow it to use the Suez Canal. Baseball great Roy Campanella was paralyzed in a car crash. Juvenile delinquency was spreading worldwide. The Soviets sent the first man-made satellite into space, the Sputnik. Later on, they would send out a dog named Laika to orbit the Earth. Now, Laika died from overheating, but this news did not become public until 2002. Evangelist Billy Graham became a household name. Federal troops had to be called out to allow African Americans to enter an all-white high school in Arkansas. And now the moment you've all been waiting for, the invention of the hula hoop. And now a sad story in what would be called the kissing case. A little white girl, 7 or 8 years old, named Sissy Marcus, was asked by a 9-year-old African-American boy, James Thompson, and a 7-year-old friend named David Simpson to kiss them on the cheek. She did. She went home and told her mother. The mother got angry. The police were called. The boys were arrested and accused of rape. They were beaten and sentenced to be in a reform school until the age of 21. But after black leaders got involved and protests were voiced around the world, a North Carolina governor issued a pardon and the boys were released. Okay, that was pretty sad, and I'm sure you're angry, but we need to move on. Scientists create nuclear fusion by smashing 2 light atoms together and creating heat of 100 million degrees, the temperature of a hydrogen bomb. Paramount would sell the TV rights to all pre-1948 movies for $50 million. Indonesian rebels are driven out of the country, and American poet Ezra Pound, who had been arrested for treason over 10 years earlier, finally had his insanity plea accepted and he was released. Actress Lana Turner had a gangster boyfriend named Johnny Stompanato. Johnny Stompanato was extremely violent and jealous, even getting into a fight with one of her co-stars, Sean Connery. In one evening where he got excessively violent, Lana's 14-year-old daughter, Cheryl, stepped in between them, stabbed and killed him. The courts decided that it was justifiable homicide. The Cuban Revolution was over and Fidel Castro had taken over. Now at first, Fidel Castro had promised free elections and land distribution, gained a lot of support across Latin America and even in the United States. However, he established a communist dictatorship that is still there to this very day. A plane crash took the lives of Richie Valens, Buddy Holly, and the Big Bopper. It was the day that music had died. They were all very young. Richie Valens was only 17 years old. Studio director Cecil B. DeMille dies, along with actor-comedian Lou Costello. And Charles de Gaulle, the previous French resistance fighter, becomes president of France. The United States had begun sending monkeys into space. Now, sadly, over 30 of them would die of overheating, crashes, parachutes not opening, suffocation, till finally one spider monkey survived orbiting the Earth. The spider monkey's name was Miss Baker. The Ford Motor Company had spent millions of dollars promoting the Edsel, a new model, but people found the car so ugly that they had to withdraw it. Alaska and Hawaii became the newest states to join the United States of America. U.S. Vice President would show off a modern American kitchen to Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev, and the Dalai Lama would leave Tibet to go to India. Well, everybody, that's it. For my next video, we're going to explore the turbulent 1960s. But until then, send me your comments, or better yet, subscribe. This is Cool Talk.